Identifying audience. Aim your argument at the right target. Why do you need to keenly know your audience? You need to speak the audience's language. For example, you need to understand if there are technical terms or things that would go above their heads. On the flip side, if there is language that would make them more comfortable, you want to use that as well. Hit them where it hurts. If you're trying to make an emotional appeal, you need to understand what will move them. If you want to make the audience excited about your topic, you need to understand what will get them excited. Relate to them. An audience will be most responsive when you can find common experiences, tell anecdotes, do things that really connect you beyond a superficial level. And finally, understand their perspectives, especially if you want to convince an audience that may not already be on board with what you're talking about. What factors affect an audience? Take a minute and either jot down your ideas or just think about the different aspects of an audience that you might consider when you're making a speech or writing an essay. There are a number of factors to consider. For example, age, gender, ethnicity, location, education, political leanings, values, and religion to begin with. While identifying your audience and targeting them is important, you want to avoid stereotypes. For example, don't look at a female audience and say, oh, they must like this type of doll. Or look at an older population and say, I think they enjoy hard butterscotch candy. You want to instead think about the references that they will understand, the issues that matter to them, etc. Before we jump into essays, let's take a look at a few advertisements first. Advertisements are a wonderful way to practice identifying audience because they really rely on targeting a specific group of people for their product or their message. The first one I'm going to walk you through, then I'm going to display two separate ones for you to practice on your own. Let me read the caption beneath and then talk about the picture. One child is holding something that's been banned in America to protect them. Guess which one? Obviously, the two children are holding two very different objects. The first is a high-frequency gun, the second a book. Obviously, this is not an ad geared for children, even though children are pictured. Instead, I would argue this is an advertisement meant to affect parents, grandparents, or anyone who would be concerned about a child's safety. I also think the language is very accessible. So in terms of education, location, language barriers, and things like that, it would mostly be understandable to anyone that looked. The pictures really highlight the idea of the advertisement, which is there are strict regulations on certain books. Certain books are banned, but the same regulations do not necessarily apply to the guns. Now take a look at the second advertisement and ask yourself who you think the advertisement is geared towards. Who is the audience? In case it's too small for you to read, in the bottom right corner, the caption says, "Kill a cigarette and save a life. Yours." Take a moment, either jot down your ideas or just think. Okay, in this case, I would argue that the age of the person is not necessarily targeting that age audience. Anyone who smokes, I believe, would be affected by this. It is certainly not an ad to convince people who already do not smoke that it is the right choice, but instead, the shocking imagery of the gun in the smoke pointed at the head of someone smoking would mean that it's targeted towards smokers of any age, although having a young person in the article, or in the advertisement rather, might indicate that they're targeting a bit of a younger audience. While the caption is certainly moving and important, you wouldn't even need to read the words to really understand what the advertisement is. There's no specific language that is technical or segments a certain population. Let's take a look at one more. I'd like to read the caption for you. What goes in the ocean goes in you. Take a moment and decide what audience you think the ad is targeting. I would argue in this case the caption matters because the picture is not completely apparent right when you look at it. For me, I needed to read the caption first and then really study the picture to understand that the sushi rolls are not wrapped in seaweed, they're wrapped in plastic, and that there's plastic tucked inside as well. I would also argue that this probably is an advertisement that would reach people who are health conscious. Sushi is not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, so they're not going for a super broad audience, but instead they're thinking about people who already might be a little health conscious and saying to them that recycling and taking care of the planet certainly matters, because if they're ingesting plastic in their fish and in their food, that's going to hurt their health. Again, I think that would indicate health conscious audience. In terms of age, I feel like most ages would be affected by this. And again, you would need to be able to read the advertisement because I think that caption absolutely enriches what the meaning is. Now we're going to translate the skills that you just used on those advertisements and transfer them to openings of 3 essays. Please pay careful attention to each of these essays because ultimately you'll be selecting one to read in its entirety throughout the week. Let me start with this one. The other night, my 3-year-old nephew and I received an unexpected economics lesson in the form of a picture book called Rainbow Fish. The plot is deceptively simple. Rainbow Fish is an underwater denizen distinguished by a set of unusually attractive silver scales. A small blue fish asks RF to give him one of his scales, and RF refuses. Shunned as a result by all of the other fish, RF consults a wise old octopus who encourages him to reconsider. Give your scales away, the octopus advises. You won't be as pretty, but the other fish will like you, and you'll be happy. So he does, and he is. The end. Just as I looked at the advertisement for clues, I'm also going to pay careful attention to the references within this opening paragraph. It certainly would speak to anyone who's read to a small child, whether it's a parent or a grandparent, even though it references a picture book. The idea that they're looking at economics right in the opening indicates that it really isn't an essay written for a 3-year-old, but instead for, again, someone who is moved and interested, intrigued by the reference, but really is interested in an economics lesson. The language is complex at times, for example, the underwater denizen distinguished, nice alliteration, but ultimately it is not overly complex and it is not a financial document. Even though it references an economics lesson, it is not something that you would need to have intricate financial information to understand. For this one, after I read it, I'm going to give you a minute or two just to think about audience and try to determine on your own who this would speak to. Who would this be an effective opening for? My hair was too short, and my U.S. government glasses were horn-rimmed, ugly, and all that first winter in school, the other Indian boys chased me from one corner of the playground to the other. They pushed me down, buried me in the snow until I couldn't breathe, thought I'd never breathe again. They stole my glasses and threw them over my head, around my outstretched hands, just beyond my reach until someone tripped me and sent me falling again face down in the snow. I was always falling down. My Indian name was Junior Falls Down. Sometimes it was bloody nose or steal his lunch. Once it was cries like a white boy, even though none of us had seen a white boy cry. Take a minute, look at the language, the references, figure out who you think the audience might be. Okay, let's come back together. What do you think? When I was looking at this, I absolutely thought it would relate to anyone who had had a difficult time in school. Someone who maybe hadn't felt like they fit in, which could honestly be almost anyone, depending on what year of school you're talking about. It also references phrases that indicate he's talking about a reservation. He talks about the Indian boys. He talks about the nicknames, which mimic some traditional Indian names. However, I would argue he's not necessarily talking to other Indian students who are sharing in the experience, but instead he's really trying to paint a picture, perhaps for folks who have had difficulty in school, but haven't had his type of difficulty in school, so that we can relate and understand. I would assume from this, and obviously I've read the essay already, but just from the introduction, I would bet that he's going to move into speaking more specifically about the reservation, but first wants to get us on the same page to relate to him so that he can open up a world to us. Okay, let's take a look at one more. Professional boxing is the only major American sport whose primary and often murderous energies are not coyly defected by such artifacts as balls and pucks. Though highly ritualized and as rigidly bound by rules, traditions, and taboos as any religious ceremony, it survives as the most primitive and terrifying of contests. Two men, near naked, fight each other in a brightly lit, elevated space, roped in like an animal pen, though the ropes were originally to keep rowdy spectators out. Two men climb into the ring from which only one, symbolically, will climb out. Take a moment and ask yourself, who do you think the author is speaking to? Okay. First question I would ask myself, since the author is referencing sports, would be, is he or she speaking specifically to a sports audience? I would argue no, because anyone who is a fan of boxing would probably not appreciate it being called primary, murderous, fighting almost to the death, roped in like an animal. The language definitely is condemning sports, or at least this sport. So I would argue that the author is speaking to people who first have a strong grasp on language. The language is certainly not simple here, but also would be people who would not view sports in necessarily a positive light. If she was trying, for example, to convince an audience that loved boxing, that instead it was not so good, first she would need to establish some common ground with them. Instead, she comes at boxing pretty strong and immediately pulls it apart, meaning she's probably speaking to an audience that already is predisposed to not loving boxing.